Welcome, one and all. My name is Tyler Friedman, and I am the Director of Collections, Education, and Research at the Museum of Wisconsin Art. I'm delighted to be here, albeit virtually, with what promises to be an insightful panel on immigration that we're doing in conjunction with MOA's current exhibition, Artists Without Borders, Reflections on Art and Place, which is on view at West Bend, the MOA West Bend location, through July 3rd, and at our downtown outpost, MOA DTN, located in St. Kate the Arts Hotel, through August 1st. MOA would like to extend heartfelt thanks to the Wisconsin Humanities Council for their generous support of this event, as well as other exhibition programs being held in conjunction with Artists Without Borders. We would also like to thank the Greater Milwaukee Foundation for their support of the exhibition. Before I introduce our panelists, I wanted to welcome everyone to submit comments and questions throughout the talk. We'll reserve the final 20 minutes or so of the talk for the questions from the audience. So although I won't pose any of the questions until then, please feel free to submit them as they occur to you. And now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our esteemed panelists. We have R. Timothy Muth, a staff attorney at the ACLU of Wisconsin since 2016. Tim, if I may, graduated from Harvard Law School in 1986. He spent 30 years as a litigator at a large Wisconsin law firm before leaving to come to work at the ACLU. And in 2015, Tim was named by the Wisconsin Law Journal a leader in law. Tim is especially passionate about El Salvador, where he spends half of his time doing human rights work, and he's the founder and editor-in-chief of El Salvador Perspectives, a news, politics, culture blog. Tim works with migrants along the migrant trail before they leave, while they're en route, et cetera. And I'm sure that's a theme that we'll get into during the panel. And additionally, Tim publishes Wisconsin Immigration Focus, a bi-weekly newsletter of immigration news relevant to the state of Wisconsin. Tim, thank you very much for being here.
Glad to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Absolutely. We also have with us Rachel Ida Buff. Dr. Buff is the director of the Community and Cultures program at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, as well as a full professor in the Department of History. She's taught many courses since coming to UWM in 2004, including seminars on immigration and popular culture, rhetorics of citizenship, and immigration history. She's the author of countless articles and several books, including Immigration and the Political Economy of Home, West Indian Brooklyn and American Indian Minneapolis, 1945 to 1992, Against the Deportation Terror, Organizing for Immigrant Rights in the 20th Century, and Immigrant Rights in the Shadow of U.S. Citizenship, which she edited. Dr. Buff's most recent book is A is for Asylum Seeker, Words for People on the Move. The book reframes key words that describe people on the move, from asylum seeker to zero tolerance policy. Written in both English and Spanish, this glossary provides an intersectional and historically grounded consideration of words deployed in the inflamed debate about migration, offering a valuable perspective on the challenges and aspirations of people on the move everywhere. And last but certainly not least, we have with us Iuscely Flores. Iuscely Flores is a student at UWM. She came to the United States when she was 4 years old with her parents from Durango, Mexico. In high school, Iuscely became involved with community activism when access to in-state tuition was restricted by a former governor. Through Voces de la Frontera and Yes, Youth Empowered in the Struggle, Iuscely led the effort to form the Wisconsin Tuition Equity Committee, on which she served as a co-chair. More recently, Iuscely worked with state voices to ensure equal and accurate representation during the 2020 census. As a multimedia artist, Iuscely weds her political science background, personal experience, and digital know-how to create virtual art about the struggle for liberation and self-determination. Iuscely has been outspoken about her undocumented status and remains in the U.S. as part of the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or the DACA policy. And she's also outspoken about the shortcomings of this policy and the heartbreaking decisions that undocumented families are forced to make. So once again, thank you three for being here. I'm really looking forward to this panel. And I wanted to begin by going around and inviting each of you to share how immigration became the central theme in your life and work. And I sort of jumped the gun or stepped on your toes, Iuscely. So we'll start with you.
Okay, real quick before we begin, I want to really honor this land and the space that we're in. I'm in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. It's a beautiful gathering place by the water, Minnewaking. We're on traditional Potawatomi, Ho-Chunk, and Menominee homeland, as well as Black liberators' land across the southwest shores of Michigamme, North America's largest system of freshwater lakes, where the Milwaukee, Menominee, Kinnickinnic rivers meet. And the people of Wisconsin's sovereign Anishinaabe, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Oneida, and Mohican nations remain present. Definitely here to honor all of our relations, our Native, Black, Indigenous relatives of the African diaspora, LGBTQIA+, Two-Spirit relatives, gender non-conforming, non-binary, Latinx, and immigrants, relatives of the global majority, young, working, poor, disabled, unhoused relatives, and our collective historic and recent efforts, wins, and struggles. So with that, I want to start by just sharing a quick, maybe like a timeline of events of how I came to the US. I was 5 years old, so February 9th, 2002, my parents and I landed in O'Hare Airport in Chicago, and I was only wearing a just like a shirt, and we only had a backpack and my mom's carry-on and my dad's carry-on, because if you wanted to buy luggage, it was more expensive if you want to buy yeah. And so out of my backpack, she like took out a shirt and put it on me, and then she took out one of my dad's like long sleeves and put it on me, and I'm just like this little kid like watching this being put all over me, and I didn't understand why until we like stepped outside of the airport, and like it's February in Chicago, and I couldn't like I didn't have the words for like the cold that I was feeling on my cheeks. It was just like a burning sensation. And to this day, every winter, I still feel that burning on my cheeks. Like now I understand it's cold, but it's like this burning sensation. And so with that, I always asked my parents why. Why did we come to the US? Like, why are we here, right? And my dad's like, well, we came to the US because we needed jobs. Well, why do we need jobs? Like, why weren't there any jobs in Mexico? Like, why, right? So all these whys. And eventually, when I graduated high school, I overexhausted my dad's knowledge because he stopped going to school when he was a junior in high school, and my mom stopped, school around the same time. So I always asked why, and thankfully through the university system and through organizations like Yes and Voices, I was able to really find that why and understand that like the overall answer to why we came to the US was neoliberalism. That word, I never learned it in high school. I never learned it it wasn't until like maybe like my third year of college where I finally went home to my dad, and he's a welder by trade, but in the US he used to install carpet. And so I like came home, I was like, Dad, I know why we came to the US, because my grandpa lost all of his, so my grandpa used to be a tradesperson from the US to Mexico in semi-trucks. So he ran a semi business. And in 1996, after the North American Free Trade Agreement, he lost his business. He had to sell his semis. My dad, who was one of his drivers, lost his job. And, obviously that's the why. Like, we came to the US because of something that the US did. And now I'm in the belly of the beast fighting the same, I guess, battle that a lot of people, especially, it's not just immigrants, but a lot of poor people and a lot of marginalized people are continuing to struggle with. So that's my why. And the immigrant movement is obviously near and dear to my heart because I had the privilege of getting DACA, but then I had the misprivilege of like missing in-state tuition by like 2 years. And then again, always asking why, like, why are we losing in-state tuition? Why? And I just continuously call it out. So yeah.
Thank you. Dr. Buff, would you like to go next? Again,
Sure.
reiterate the question. I just wanted to hear how immigration became the central theme of your work, life and work.
Sure. And I guess I want to say I'm coming to you from the once and continuous lands of the Pawtucket and the Massachusetts, also known as Boston. I think for third generation Jewish Americans like me, the question that I grew up around was, we're here, and historically, as I came to learn much later in my life, we're now sort of considered white people, mostly considered white people. I think that's a complicated thing. But I think very much in the consciousness of my parents was, do we belong here? Are we like other people? Is it safe for us to be here? Right? And I think that those questions really shaped who I am as a person and as a scholar. Questions of belonging and origin. And loss, I think, is always intrinsic in that. And I think Iuscely's really beautiful story about neoliberalism and loss, which we don't hear enough of. You know, instead we hear, oh, everybody wants to come to the US. People are impelled to come here because of histories of trauma and loss. And, you know, I'm really interested to hear from Tim, because I do similar work with Electorado, with asylum seekers who are desperate to come here. And in the work of getting them here, it's hard for me to say, like, you know, it's not that safe for you here. People are desperate to cross. So my parents were, in third generation, relatively assimilated, fluent in English, relatively confident, yet also haunted by questions of trauma and displacement. And for them, very recent history of the Holocaust in Europe, the United States intransigence in intervening when people were displaced by the Holocaust in Europe and in offering refuge. So I think that I'm a person very defined by, I'm an oldest kid. I think oldest kids, as a mom now, I can say my older daughter listens to me in a different way than my younger daughter does, right? Because she had a long time with me just saying blah, blah, blah before her sister showed up. So I think the older kid hears it in a particular way, and possibly usually the only kid hears it in a particular way. Like, you really, the things that your parents are worried about haunt you in a different way in your life. And so I listened very carefully to those stories, and it shaped who I became and what I worried about. And my career as a historian has been very much marked by my work as an activist. I have never seen these two things as separate. You know, I think that if you're worried about questions of home in your scholarship, you're worried about questions of home as a citizen, as a denizen, as a neighbor, as an inhabitant. So these questions have shaped me in ways that are pretty deep and that I think we can talk more about.
Thank you. And Tim, how did immigration become the central theme of your work?
So immigration became central growing out of my involvement with the country of El Salvador. So I began traveling and spending time in El Salvador about 20 years ago. And as I began to get immersed in visiting and studying and writing about El Salvador, there was no way you could avoid the subject of immigration. I mean, this little country in Central America has long been an exporter of people to the United States, such that right now, 1 of every 5 people alive who was born in El Salvador lives in the United States. Like 20% of Salvadorans live in the United States. And the impact on El Salvador is enormous. I mean, it's money sent back from Salvadorans living in the United States is 1/6 of the national economy in El Salvador. So as I was learning and writing about El Salvador, immigration becomes this central focus. Everybody I know in El Salvador has a friend, a relative who lives in the United States. And why are they in the United States? Well, it starts as people were fleeing from the bloody Civil War in the 1980s, a civil war that the United States funded the oppressive military regime that was fighting against guerrillas, a guerrilla war. So that people fled from the abuses of that military oligarchy during the 1980s. As the war ended, they were fleeing poverty. They were fleeing natural disasters and earthquakes. They were fleeing gang violence that was itself a product of immigration policy, because the US, in a get tough on crime policy, began deporting gang members from primarily the Southern California area to El Salvador, where there wasn't a strong gang culture at the time. And that was the birth of, I think most people have at this point, thanks to Donald Trump, heard of Mara Salvatrucha, MS-13, for example. And so people in El Salvador who choose to migrate are fleeing from gang violence, economic reasons, other kinds of reasons. And so changes in US immigration policy have strongly felt impacts in El Salvador. And so then when I started to work at the ACLU 5 years ago, it was really only natural that advocating for the rights of immigrants in our state would be part of my role at the ACLU. And I think the fact that I've had the experience in countries of origin, and also I've met with people along the trail from the Northern Triangle of Central America through Mexico, as well as in detention centers in Mexico, it starts to give insights into the cruelty of US immigration policy and sort of what we've become up to this point in the country's history.
Very interesting. So I have some questions for each of you that we can, I'll get into. We'll start again with Iuscely, but just let me encourage you as the panelists to chime in and direct the conversation in any direction you see fit. If something sparks your interest, let's pursue that tangent by all means. So Iuscely, your activism has addressed a wide range of issues, from in-state tuition to the census to driver's licenses for undocumented people. What would you say are the current pressing issues that grassroots activism is addressing?
I think we're in like the perfect time to like dream, and actually like activate and create the communities that we're dreaming. And by that, I mean police brutality. And the same cops that are killing Black and brown people are the exact same ICE agents that are deporting these immigrant communities. And so I think to bring art into the subject, when you go to the protests and you see these like beautiful banners, these beautiful just words, right? Like mi lucha es tu lucha, my struggle is your struggle. And most of the times you see like just like multicolored fists, because we recognize that we're in a state where if we don't control our narratives, this giant empire is going to just keep just like sucking us into becoming, sometimes, you know, causing war in other countries, like becoming military personnel, because that's the only way some of us can go to college. And it's an unfortunate reality. And in preparation to our talk today, I was, my boss, Matt Rothschild over at the Wisconsin Democracy Campaign, he was like, hey, here's an excellent article by Howard Zinn. And so it was an interview with him. Rise Like Lions, the Role of Artists in a Time of War. And I'm reading this, and like he's just talking about World War I and World War II, and I like, it's almost impossible to not see that now. It doesn't have the name, you know, it's not a world war, it's more of it's a nation state war where like we're struggling like as nationalities in the United States to find ourselves, and like this country is doing such a good job at keeping us alienated from each other, as in like Black and brown people fighting against police brutality, and then there's like undocumented people fighting for immigration. Like those things are never going to end if we don't like that division isn't going to end if we don't recognize that like it's the same hand, right? And something that really like caught my attention was I'm going to say his name wrong because I learned it through reading it. I've never heard it out loud. So the name is Percy Shelley. Am I saying it wrong? No, okay, thank you. And so he had a poem, The Mask of Anarchy, and one of the like last stanzas is, "You are many, they are few." And this is like garment workers, right? Like we usually think that that poor and working class people don't care about the arts, and these are garment workers like reading these poems. And I just think of the chant, no somos uno, no somos cien, somos millones, cuéntenos bien. We are not one, we are not 100, we're a million, like count us fairly, right? And that's a chant that you hear in 2021. And so I see, I guess, this grassroots movement like picking up from where nonprofits in the early 80s, when they were actually for the people, left off, because now you donate to a nonprofit and you just got a great tax break. Now a nonprofit, and I work for one, right? So I have people to feed, and it's like you have to go through this internal struggle of like, well, since the pandemic, I've been having to feed 6 people back home in Mexico, and like similar to Tim, it's like you got to feed people and you have to keep your family alive, or else this is how generations are wiped out. Tangent aside, the nonprofit is a pillar to white supremacy, and without recognizing that, the nonprofit is only benefiting from not giving enough grassroots movements the foundation that they need to be successful. And I think of mutual aid, and I think of ayuda mutua. The term mutual aid isn't new, right? The Black Panther Party had established it long ago with their free breakfast programs and just all of the access of knowledge that they give to the Black and brown and, you know, all the communities after the Rainbow Coalition was formed. But again, the government saw this as a powerful force and got rid of them, right? Got rid of the Rainbow Coalition. And so there's, in Chicago right now, there's like all of these amazing organizations that are like rising up and like out of the rubbish that the US made sure that they got rid of. And because I think we're in a world of like this world where we all have access to technology, and we all have access to cameras. We can all become filmmakers at a protest and quickly create a 30-second video. I think we're in a time where these grassroots movements can actually access and have like some tangible, like solid next steps. And I'm witness to one. I was just at the Black Leaders Organizing Community press release. They were just bashing all of these bills that were recently introduced to just put in regards to police brutality, to only put bandages on serious issues, right? And I think we have the space and the time to really mobilize our efforts with mutual aid, learning about mutual aid, learning about the just the Black and brown relationship. And I know Rachel and Tim probably can add way more than I have, but it's a struggle it's like an internal struggle to work for an organization and then try to exist in like the grassroots world without like feeling alienated from the community that like I care to and want to serve for, you know? Yeah.
Thank you. The next question will be for Rachel. So Rachel, Dr. Buff, take us into the ivory tower, if you would. What are the new directions, questions, ideas that academics are passing around regarding immigration?
So academics are at our best when we don't stay in the ivory tower, what I think. So the work that I'm most influenced by, and I'm really excited to see some of this work coming out, you know, the questions that Iuscely raised is we have to understand the pressing contemporary questions about migration as products of centuries of white supremacy and settler colonialism. They're not separate. So when Tim is talking about the migrations from El Salvador and more broadly Central America, a large portion of the contemporary migrations are folks displaced by resource extraction, dam development. A lot of these folks are indigenous in El Salvador and Guatemala and Honduras and Mexico as well, right? And so I think that one problem in academia has sometimes been kind of a disciplinary separation, like, well, there's indigenous history, and then there's immigration history, and then there's African-American history. And like, it turns out that these are part of a process, you know, so that white supremacy and settler colonialism caused displacement starting in, 1492. And as people are displaced and are figuring out really some of the questions that Iuscely was addressing, like, what does resistance mean? How do we survive here? How do we create communities? I've been thinking lately about the Quilombos, the Maroon community created in coalitions of runaway slaves and indigenous folks in the interior, in the Caribbean, in Central and South America, in the United States, in Florida, you know, in the Great Dismal Swamp in Virginia. Those communities of resistance, which are places where people fleeing this sort of onslaught, you know, what the really fabulous historian calls the apocalypse of white supremacy and settler colonialism. And Horn traces it to the 15th century, right? That this starts with processes in Europe that burst their boundaries. It's all of a piece as far as I'm concerned, right? You know, the folks who are walking to the US-Mexico border looking for asylum today, and really brilliantly, for my money, deploying terms that, you know, the United States and other countries resist applying to them, like, are you an asylum seeker if you're coming for economic reasons? You know, and their response is, we're looking for safety. We are terrified. You know, we have rights. You know, this is a brilliant reinvention of international law, I think. So what excites me most is the work that kind of pans out and sees contemporary struggles around immigrant rights as part of a 500+ year history of struggles against white supremacy and settler colonialism. We could think in the contemporary time of the use of arcane public health restrictions against particularly Haitian migrants, you know, so that the war, you know, Haiti being the first country in the Western Hemisphere, the first successful slave revolution, the first country to shut off European colonialism, like, they're still paying for that, right? In terms of neoliberal policy in Haiti, in terms of punitive policies targeted at Haitian asylum seekers fleeing, guess what? US-backed fascistic regimes in Haiti. So the only thing I wanted to add, I thought your narrative was really beautiful, but I think it's not just, you know, police violence, ICE violence, and settler colonialism in our cities. Those things are learned overseas. It's no accident that the Israeli company Al Bayt is doing innovation at the US-Mexico border, and the same border technologies are in use at the US-Mexico border as are in use in the apartheid wall in Palestine. It's literally the same stuff. It's the same people. So I'm excited by global, long-range perspectives on our contemporary moment. I could go on. I'm a professor, but I'll just stop there.
Okay, well, I'm going to ask you to elaborate a little bit. Just who are some of these scholars who are doing some of this work that you're excited by? Any books that you can recommend people might pursue if they're interested in learning more?
The amazing Gerald Horne, Horne, and his books on the apocalypse of settler colonialism. He's mostly a 20th century African-American historian, but he's turned right now to try and understand the origins of this. So his two books, The Dawning of the Apocalypse and The Apocalypse, which are about the 16th and 17th centuries, respectively, really wonderful. The Italian Marxist feminist Silvia Federici, who has a beautiful article I teach, which goes from the witchcraft trials to what she calls housewifization, saying that, you know, the witchcraft trials were a way to dispossess indigenous women's knowledges in Europe and the Americas. And, you know, she really takes it from witchcraft trials in the 15th and 16th century through the invention of the housewife in the 19th and 20th. I love that work. My comrade Manu Karaku has a beautiful book called Empire's Tracks, where he talks about the ways that Chinese migrant workers and indigenous nations were brought together during the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad, which, you know, that's what you hear in high school, like the driving of the Golden Spike, blah, blah, blah. That was a sacrifice in blood and treasure of, you know, immigrants from Mexico, from China, from Ireland, from other countries, and it was a sacrifice of indigenous land. And what Manu does in that wonderful book is trace the ways that it brought people into relation with one another, right? So it's not just dispossession and exploitation, expression, and oppression, which it is, but it's also the ways in which Chinese and Pawnee come into a relationship, not speaking each other's languages, but kind of recognizing common cause, which to me is really fascinating. So those are 3 different bodies of work that I'm really slightly in love with right now.
Wonderful. Yeah, there's nothing like a good book.
I can put the names of them in the notes so people, because like it's hard when I know I talk too fast.
Yeah, absolutely. By all means, please do. Let me use this as an opportunity. We're at the halfway mark to encourage people who are out there listening to submit any questions that you would like to hear discussed in the next 10 to 20 to 30 minutes or so. Rachel, would you talk a little bit about your most recent book? I sort of hyped it in the intro a little bit, but would you tell people what it's about in a little bit greater depth?
If I was home, I would hold up the beautiful cover designed by Iuscely. And I guess I want to say one thing about A is for Asylum Seeker, A de Asilo, and the cover that Iuscely designed. And Iuscely, feel free to chime in here, because what she did is really amazing. Iuscely works from established sort of photojournalistic images into taking them into art. So the cover that she created actually is a caravan of different migrants. The book was really inspired by the crisis, the long crisis at the border, which, you know, one of the many crisis moments was the family separation. Oh, there it is. Yay. Isn't that beautiful? Can we just take a minute and say how beautiful that cover is? It just makes me happy every single time I look at it. So I guess it's a glossary of terms, because what's happening now, just as I said, a lot of people are using the term for themselves: asylum seeker, immigrant, migrant, citizen. Those terms are inflamed. And to make a long story short, what I started noticing in 2016 was that the word refugee, which in my household was a beautiful word, meaning harbor and safety, was starting to sound like a curse. And I just got really curious about how, refugee, to me, whenever I say the word refugee, it has like a kind of an orange yellow halo around it, like refuge, safety, sanctuary. All those words are so beautiful to me, I'm going to cry. But my students, some of them were using them as curses, and I was like, what the heck? And so that's why I wrote this glossary, which is written for high school, college, your church group, your communist cell, whatever, for people to read and educate ourselves and each other about.
Excellent, wonderful. So Tim, what would you say are the central legal issues that characterize contemporary immigration law and policy?
So I really appreciate being able to listen to Iuscely and Rachel, and from the grassroots and deep thinking about neocolonialism and all of these things. And unfortunately, I'm going to take us into the dirty world of law and politics, and get a little bit practical. So when we talk about, what's the current state of immigration law and policy, it's useful to divide it up into 2 parts. So one part is, what's the U.S. policy with respect to the reception of immigrants into the country? So that's the question of border crossers, asylum seekers, refugees, which I think should be a beautiful word, and visas for work and study. So that's one area, the reception of people into the country. And then the second question is, what is the country's approach to the approximately 11 million undocumented persons in the country, many of whom have lived in this country for decades, paying taxes, working, often being exploited by our economic system, but who lack legal status. And I'm actually going to start with that second area of how we deal with our undocumented brothers and sisters. So President Biden has introduced legislation into Congress for a path to citizenship for undocumented persons who don't have a criminal history. It is similar to legislation proposed first by George W. Bush, then by Obama, none of which managed to get passed. And I'm not sure that there is, frankly, much prospect in our current Congress as well of that. Short of that, legislation such as the DREAM Act, which would allow Iuscely, for example, to get a permanent residence and then citizenship, as well as people who are in the country on temporary protected status. There's another bill for immigrant farm workers, particularly supported by the dairy industry in Wisconsin. Some of these measures have a better prospect of a passage, but not surprisingly, the roadblock is the Republicans in the Senate and the existence of the filibuster rule. Our failure to act over, literally decades, it is shameful. But unfortunately, at the moment, I'm not particularly hopeful. I mean, fingers crossed we'll get the DREAM Act adopted, because really, when you look at it, it was the grassroots organizers, people like Iuscely, who went out, campaigned, got people out to vote, that helped make the difference in Wisconsin and other swing states that got Joseph Biden elected, as well as other Democratic candidates in the Senate. With respect to incoming migration, I'd say the situation is more complicated. So during the Trump administration, it's fair to say that there was an effort to limit, reduce, cut as much as possible anybody coming into the country from outside. I mean, that was a presidential administration that started with the Muslim ban and, believe it or not, went downhill from there, and dramatically lowering the number of refugees being admitted from situations of tragedy around the world, doing everything to make seeking asylum from Central America almost impossible. And eventually, it was actually the pandemic that provided Trump with his most effective tool for keeping people out of the country, as embassies were closed around the world because you couldn't come into an embassy because of COVID, so you didn't have to deal with people getting visas. And probably most harshly, getting the Centers for Disease Control to issue something called a rule under, or an order under Title 42 of the US Code, that basically said people crossing the southern US border were a health risk to the country because of the pandemic, and could be, if they were picked up after crossing, immediately expelled from the country. No due process, nothing, just you're in the country, you're a health risk, and you are immediately expelled from the country. And that produced the most dramatic drop in the number of people being admitted across the southern border into the United States. Biden is starting to reverse some of these changes, but not nearly as fast as many of us who want this to be a welcoming nation would like. He's increasing the refugee cap for about 8 hours, saying he wasn't going to increase the refugee cap. But Title 42 is still in place. Thousands of people every week continue to be expelled across the southern border for this made-up reason that they pose a health risk in crossing the border. So today we're still a long way from a just and a humane system. And unfortunately, as long as there are politicians who see political advantage in demonizing people who are seeking refuge and a better life in the United States. It's going to be a lucha, a struggle, to produce these long-needed changes.
Thank you. Tim, what you were just saying, I think, leads very naturally into my next question, which was, how have the past 15 crazy months of pandemic life changed everything that we've been talking about? How has it, you have discussed how it changed immigration policy. How has it changed the lives of undocumented immigrants, the prospects of those who are hoping to immigrate? So I'll just throw that question out to the three of you, and be interested to hear how the pandemic has affected all of these questions and themes.
I'll share quickly. In 2018, my parents self-deported, so they went back to Mexico. And like language, I like the term self-deported. It was, their choice to leave, but the consulate, the Mexican consulate at the time was like, we've never seen this before in our 10 years. Like, we don't even know how to help you. Like, we just know, like, you just kind of have to figure it out, right? And thankfully, my love for learning, I was like, all right, let's make a pamphlet. Let's help other undocumented people do this. And it was 2018. Like, we were not expecting a pandemic. My dad wasn't expecting a pandemic. By trade, he's a welder. So, and by luck, he got a job at a mill in like rural Durango, Mexico, fixing machines, like just, making sure machines are working. And he brought all his tools from the US. So the company didn't have to like invest anything in like buying his, tools. And it was like, there's 30 men. So about like, maybe like less than 1,000 people all together living in this village. And they let everybody go because of the pandemic, because the space was so small that they shouldn't all be in that space. And that's when I learned how like pandemics in the past have wiped out generations. Like at one point I became a support system for my great grandma, my dad, my mom, and then an uncle who also worked at the mill, his daughter, his wife. And it was impossible to process that this is my duty now, right? Like, it's become a job. And I had to go to therapy, and my therapist was like, just cut them off. Like, they're here, right? And the privilege, right? The privilege that we as like first generation or like Americans of like just being able to like yell back at our parents and tell them like, no, I'm not, like, it's impossible. And like, I knew that this was my duty to like keep my lineage alive and make sure my family was healthy and well. And now, as everything is kind of like simmering down as far as like the pandemic, and like this company opened at least for half of the employees, and my dad had a secure job beforehand and they promised him one now. Like, it was a tough, almost 2 years, and it continues to be. Some of that work, that support, like Tim was mentioning, like, you don't send money to, in like an expectation of like, this is like, I don't send it to like feel good about like I'm sending it. It's just like a duty. Like, it just becomes an added responsibility, whether the pandemic existed or not, right? I knew that this was something that I might one day have to happen. And it definitely influences how I live in the United States, because then like you have to restrict yourself as, and change therapists and find somebody that understands immigration, and find a more down person of color, like a more like, yeah, it was a lot. And through that, I lost my job halfway. I tried organizing a union. They fired 6 of us who tried, and that's as much as I can say about that. And so it was like just painful to not be with my parents when I had COVID in November, and like painful to like know that like I still had to support them even through COVID. And it just keeps attacking you in all of these places, and it just makes you more angry and more passionate to want to see this change.
I'm interested in hearing a little bit more. I apologize if this is overly personal, and feel free to not address this question, but you mentioned that the decision to self-deport was seemingly unprecedented, that the consulate had never heard of people to do that. What were some of the reasons behind that decision?
Yeah, so my dad was the contractor. He learned how to install carpet, and obviously Wisconsin, we have really cold weather, so this is the place if you want to be a carpet contractor. And he had a project in Waukesha, and he kept getting, so it was a 7 or 8 day project, and he kept getting pulled over by the same sheriff. Like, the sheriff knew that he was undocumented because he did have a driver's license that was expired from Seattle, Washington, from like when we moved from Seattle to Milwaukee. It was 2007. So he had an expired driver's license, and so then the cop would just give him a ticket for an expired driver's license. And this is during a Trump era where like these police brutality is just spiking, that people think they have free reign. And as much as I love my dad for being so fearless by bringing me here, some of that like fear creeped in, and he saw that I was like a more independent woman and like just like transforming into who I was supposed to be. And he's like, all right, I took off all my wings and I took off all my feathers, put these feathers on your wings, and it's just like your turn to fly, basically. And he, that's basically why. Yeah.
It's extraordinary. Rachel?
I just think Iuscely's story is so important because the refusal of our legislation here in Wisconsin, a state completely dependent on undocumented labor,
Yeah.
to grant people legal driver's license sets all of those people who make it possible. I mean, the people who died here first and in the greatest numbers, essential workers in the slaughterhouse dairy industry, those folks are sitting ducks intentionally for deportation because they can't drive legally, right? So you hear all this hoo-ha about criminal aliens. The way to solve the criminal alien problem is make it legal for them to drive. One of many ways to solve it. Because like if your dad hadn't had to have that fear, and you're not alone. This is a story I hear again and again.
Yeah.
Like people are driving on borrowed time. The sheriff knows who they are. If the sheriff's nice, the sheriff maybe won't, but like that's how people get detained and deported. And I guess I also want to piggyback on the question we were talking about before about Trump. It's easy to feel like, oh, phew, that's over. We have Biden now. But the deportations, the detentions haven't stopped.
Yeah.
There are fewer, but there's still thousands. All kinds of deportation, all kinds of detention are always family separation.
Mm-hmm.
Every person who's taken into custody, taken into ICE custody, forced to leave voluntarily or involuntarily, all those people are separated from their relatives every single time. So I think Iuscely's story is so important, and I think it's million.
Yeah, just to get back for a second to your question about COVID, but tying into this question of Wisconsin, one of the things that sort of showed what is really part of our white supremacist institutions was an argument in front of the Wisconsin Supreme Court. And this was, and the question was brought up, and there was a talk about the outbreak in the Green Bay area that was related to the meat processing plants. And when the Chief Justice of the Wisconsin Supreme Court said, well, that's not regular people who were part of that outbreak. You saw this vision, this clear vision of there's those others. They were the ones who were getting sick. And then when Robin Voss was asked about an outbreak in, I don't remember if it was Racine or Kenosha, and blamed it on the living conditions of the immigrant communities, that it's the way the immigrants live together. Of course, they're going to get sick. Brought out front and center the really ugly things that perhaps before the pandemic, were just whispered and said separately. But in a lot of ways, the pandemic has exposed even more strongly the racism, the xenophobia. Add to that the attacks on the AAPI communities. It's the pandemic is horrible as a public health issue, but it is also horrible for all of the division that it exposes and makes almost, people seem to think is more acceptable now, and it, led by, the former administration.
And I want to tie in grassroots movement and politics. We live in a gerrymandered state, and undocumented, and I want to tie in undocumented people as well. I forget, you don't live in my head. And so in the state of Washington, organizations rallied and organized about $40 million to undocumented people during the pandemic. If the state of Washington can do it, so many other states can do it. But in Wisconsin alone, it was up to grassroots organizations. Voces de la Frontera did some fundraising. They reached about $100,000. But then and they had like a kind of like it was unfortunate that they had to have a survey of like where are you on the list of like not having privileges. And so like it was like the more affected you were, like the more chances you had to like receiving this funding, unfortunately. But I supported Ayuda Mutua Milwaukee we raised about $87,000, and we were able to support. And this is where like I understand that we cannot conceptualize numbers to the sizes that we think we can, because $87,000 sounds like a lot of money, but that only helped 200 people, 200 families. So when we think of like super hyper capitalists like Jeff Bezos, who has like $1 trillion, like it's almost impossible. Like world hunger can end. Like, yeah. I just wanted to add those couple of things.
Well, we only have 7 or so minutes left. So by way of conclusion, I wanted to go around the panel one more time and have each of you put forth one reason to be optimistic and one way of avoiding complacency.
I am continually blown away by the inventive optimism of people on the move in their insistence on their own dignity and rights. The fine US historian Patricia Nelson Limerick used to say that every American should run to the border and embrace somebody crossing illegally for their enduring faith in the American dream. But I think it's global. I think it's bigger than that. And I think when we see people getting in leaky boats in the Mediterranean, when we see people walking with their kids overland from Honduras, when we see their insistence on being seen and heard and on sending help to their family and friends and connecting with their relatives in this country who can help them, that makes me really furious because of the forces arrayed against them, and really hopeful.
I can go next. So what makes me optimistic is the energy and passion and work of people like Iuscely, because I think it's that energy that will be the forces of change. Something for people to do if you want to learn more. I know we've all been watching Netflix during the pandemic, and there are 2 documentaries, one called Immigration Nation and the other called Living Undocumented, both on Netflix, which will help those people get an inside look at our immigration system.
And Tim, I actually haven't given myself the time to watch those because I'm afraid of the PTSD that they might cause. Yeah. But I think for somebody that has the privilege to not have experienced this, I think it's really important that they do.
Yeah, don't watch them, Iuscely. But people with privilege, watch them so that you understand what your privilege is and commit to do something about it.
Yeah. And I'll end with just asking why. Like, even if you're a person of privilege, like, why do I have this privilege? Where does this privilege come from? And what can I do to give it back more than anything? Like, and if you're not, like, understanding why why you're here and who brought you here and whose ancestors and what greatness are you carrying? Yeah.
Beautiful. Well, I want to thank all three of you for taking the time to participate in this panel, for the fearless speech contained herein, for the compassionate and important work that each of you are doing in very different directions. I look forward to seeing what you individually and as a group, and what all of us together are capable of accomplishing and making the world a better place. So by way of conclusion, once again, thank you. I hope that people will have an opportunity to come see the exhibitions, Artists Without Borders, once again, that's in West Bend through July 3rd, and at MOA DTN and St. Kate the Arts Hotel through August 1st. We like to think that this exhibition is an opportunity for having these sorts of discussions mediated by the work of art by 9 Wisconsin artists, 7 of whom were born abroad, 2 of whom are first-generation immigrants, and all of whose work deals quite explicitly with questions of identity, belonging, immigration, and all the constellation of themes that are related. So I hope to see you there. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thanks.
Thank you all.